next speaker is going to address agricultural water challenges. We're pleased to have Rich Budell, who joined the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services in 1985, and he currently serves as the Director of Agricultural Water Policy Program. He's responsible for overseeing the statewide program to implement best management agricultural practices. His office is also responsible for assessing future water needs on agriculture as part of the regional basin-wide management planning and the regional water supply planning efforts. He recently completed work for the National Academy of Sciences evaluating nutrient reduction strategies in Chesapeake Bay. Rich Budell.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the introduction, John. It's very nice to be here. I appreciate AIF extending the invitation for me to give a little overview of the challenge that I think the ag industry faces moving forward in the water supply arena. I'm going to focus on water supply. We've got plenty of water quality challenges, but I'm going to focus mostly on the water supply side. I do have to say it's a little bit intimidating being up here. You know, you look at the agenda and it's, you know, chairman, 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 leader, chairman, chairman, random state employee. You know, it's flattering. Certainly I'm flattered to be on here, but it is a little intimidating to try to follow that lineup. But so what I'd like to do is well, it was actually the 2013 session when the legislature saw fit with the leadership of Senator Grimsley and Representative Travis Hudson to modify Part 7 of Chapter 373 to provide more of a formal role for the Department of Agriculture to play in regional water supply planning. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a little overview of what we've tried to do in the 16 or so months since that law went into effect in July of 2013. And what we've tried to do is you gather the data statewide. Basically what we are now is kind of the data filter for all ag water use and projections for future need. We filter the data, gather the data, work with the water management districts, work with USGS, work with the ag industry, with DEP, with all the players who permit and manage water resources, and try to then filter those data sets, try to bring a little more consistency to how they're looked at, and then provide those data sets to the districts in both tabular and graphic form for them to use in developing their regional water supply plans. Boy, these lights really are killer, I gotta tell you. So what I'd like to do then is just give you a little overview of what we've done and then end up with talking about what I think some of the real challenges are. The challenges are real and they're varied, and I'll try to give as much detail on that as possible. Basically, this is something that everybody's used to looking at. I think it's just a breakout of the 2010 water demand or actual water use curves. You show public supply, agriculture are huge. It's 80% of all the water used statewide are in those two sectors. Public supply has overtaken agriculture as the largest water user. It used to be the other way around just a few years before. Those two lines will never cross again. I don't anticipate agriculture will ever use more water than public supply in Florida again. And then you see the smaller users, recreational, industrial, commercial, institutional, domestic self-supply, and power generation. And the next slide, though, is interesting. It shows how that is going to change over the next 20 years. You see we expect water demand to grow by 20% from 6.4 to 7.7 billion gallons per day statewide. But what I like to point out is over here in this slide, it doesn't show up. Anyway, in the right-hand column, I'm not sure you can see the numbers, is the biggest driver of future demand is population growth. If you look at that, population or public supply is supposed to increase by about 30%. That's 782 billion gallons. The total need over that 20-year period is 1.3 billion gallons. Half of it, over half of it, is going to be public supply. Very small increase in agriculture. The largest, or the two of the bigger percentage growers are also recreational and power generation. And that just kind of gives you a perspective of where the growth is likely to occur. You see a large jump from 41% to 45% in the domestic supply part. And while agriculture's demand will go up slightly, 5%, the overall percentage drops by 5%. And it's our responsibility to try to make sure that we do an adequate job in our description of the future needs of agriculture so that the Water Management District and the regional water supply plans allow for that. They provide for a mechanism for agriculture's water use to be sustained over the long term. We don't need a lot of new water, but there is going to be some regional needs, and I'll show you what makes me conclude that in the next couple of slides. And these really don't show up very well, but what I'm trying to show here is that there's a lot of competition, and the competition for water varies from county to county. These 5 counties, that's Marion, Seminole, Orange, Hillsborough, and Miami-Dade, those 5 counties, their public supply demand is 60% or greater, or very close to it, as opposed to the statewide demand of only 41%. And that puts agriculture and public supply at a little more competitive situation in those counties. You'll see in the next series of slides that some of those counties are some of our highest productive agricultural county as well. So it sets itself up for some conflict, and we've got to make sure that the regional water supply plans address not only the needs of the public supply side, we've got to make sure that we're protecting the economic base, the tax base for those counties, and future agricultural needs in those same counties. And it isn't like that statewide. So, and what I've tried to do in this presentation is sift these data and present it in a way that I've never seen them presented before. I've been in this business almost 30 years, and I know the districts have been doing regional water supply planning since the mid-90s. I've just never seen the data presented in this way. We're trying to mirror water needs with economic impact and just try to paint a little different picture to inform folks of what we think the future will look like. Here, and I noticed this on the way down here, in my haste to get these slides completed, I single-handedly gave Orange County a latitude adjustment. I just kind of thought of that on the way up here. It's pretty funny. It's hard to do that. I saw Chip, and I see Rob's here, and there's others, I'm sure, from Orange County, but I just thought you'd get a kick out of that. Anyway, that is, Orange is right. It's just pointing to the wrong county. It's pointing to Marion County. It should be pointing at Orange County. But what I'm trying to show you in this slide is when you look at Palm Beach and Hendry County, those 2 counties use 38% of all of the agricultural demand statewide. 38% of the agricultural demand for water is in those 2 counties. They are also the 2 most highly productive agricultural counties from a receipts, gate receipts value. Almost $1.5 billion of agricultural crops are grown in those 2 counties. You look at the other counties there, like Hillsborough, Suwannee, supposed to be Orange, Miami, Hendry, and Manatee. Those other counties, they total almost 2 billion gallons in gate receipts, but don't use anywhere near that amount of money, of water. So there's a lot of regional variability between value and water use. There's different crops are grown, different irrigation systems are used, different methods of irrigation, and those all have an impact not only on crop value, but water use. Palm Beach County is dominated by seepage irrigation on mostly sugar and vegetable lands, and that's a different irrigation method. It's a very effective irrigation method. It's the only way that they can really irrigate in the EAA, the Everglades Agricultural Area. There isn't an opportunity to do a lot of irrigation system retrofits in those production systems, but elsewhere around the state there is, and we're working very hard with the ag industry statewide on conservation. This is another slide that just gives you a sense of irrigated acreage. When you look statewide at irrigated acreage, 10 counties utilize 68% of the water. And it obviously, it's a lot of overlap with that slide I just gave you before, but it just points out that the regional differences between and the intensity of production in South Florida, the reason that is because it's a winter growing season. It's basically a year-round growing season. They don't really grow much of anything in the summer. It's too hot. But they do a lot of production in the southern part of that in the wintertime. Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, Hendry are a lot of winter vegetable production areas. And that makes those crops very valuable, and it makes Florida unique. The interesting thing is when they need the water is the driest time of the year in South Florida. And that's why they rely so much on Lake Okeechobee and the Lake Okeechobee regulation. The Lake Okeechobee service area is the area that relies almost exclusively on the lake. It's looking really good this year. We're at just under 16 feet going into the dry season. That's about as optimum as we could be going into the dry season. So it almost assures there'll be plenty of water for the upcoming winter dry season. But it also points out the importance of lake management and managing lake levels and dike restoration so that we can hopefully put some more water into the lake to give us a buffer both ways to prevent heavy discharges to tide and protect the estuaries, but also make sure there's adequate water, not just for agriculture. All of the lower East Coast, all of the public utilities rely in part on lake releases and lake water to recharge local aquifers or direct surface water use. So it's a very, very key component of the whole water picture across Florida. This is a slide that we see, and the trends that I'm just trying to point out here is while agricultural acreage is going down, irrigated acreage is pretty flat. And in the past, there's been this mindset that as agricultural acreage decreases, water demand also decreases. And that's just not the case. We only irrigate about 17% of the agricultural land in Florida. Only about 17% of it's irrigated. And those two have nothing to do with each other. So decreases in agricultural acreage do not necessarily mean there's a linear decrease in water need. In fact, in many rural counties, we anticipate over the next 20 years, you'll see an increase in irrigated acreage. Demand for food, demand for fresh food. Florida grows food. A lot of the rest of the country grows feed. But we grow stuff that goes right on your table. Peppers, celery, radishes, eggplant, corn, the things that go from the farm to your table. And really, Florida, Texas, and California are really the ones that do that in a big, big way. There's apples in New York and tomatoes in North Carolina and stuff like that. But in a big commercial way, it's those three states that really provide you with the food that you ate today and eat every day. So on to some of the demands or some of the challenges. I've just got a couple more slides. You've heard a lot about alternative water supply development today. The funding for that is going to be enormous, but we have to start somewhere. We have to commit to a long-term plan. We know we don't have unlimited resources, but there's got to be some way to devote recurring dollars at some level to alternative water supply development. There has to be a way, and that's one of the things that we're going to be working very hard on in the next couple of years during this water sessions, is really focusing on how can we come up with a method to assure that there's going to be long-term funding for regional water supply planning. It started out really well in 2005, petered out a couple of years later. It needs to really be refocused on. Conservation in the ag industry, I think, is a huge commitment, and I believe the ag industry is kind of the poster child of conservation. If you think about the citrus industry 25 or 30 years ago, everybody was on overhead irrigation. It's almost wholesale converted now to drip and microjet. It's resulted in a lot of conservation of water. There's not a lot of additional opportunity to get conservation out of the citrus industry. We're still working very hard on weather station disbursement across the state, soil moisture probes, electronic irrigation system controllers to give landowners more real-time information to better manage an efficient irrigation system. Those tools are important, and we'll be able to continue to tweak more conservation. The biggest lift, I think, is in irrigation systems, center pivots. You heard Senator Montford mention those in South Georgia. North Florida, that's the method of choice to irrigate across much of North Florida. We're retrofitting a lot of those systems, making them much more efficient. A retrofit of a system, getting rid of those high-pressure clacker guns that you see down the radial arm of that irrigation system, putting in low-pressure nozzles that drop down, get the water a lot closer to the crop. They're much more efficient. They save about 1 million gallons per crop, per system. And we think we've achieved about 50 MGD in conservation over the course of the last decade through those retrofit programs statewide. So this is really the list. This is my final slide, and really kind of captures the situation that we deal with. Agriculture is really an unknown. We have a hard time figuring out what we're going to do in 5 years, let alone in a 20-year regional water supply plan. What's the industry going to look like? Nobody heard of greening, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Well, they'd heard of it, but we weren't having to deal with it. And it's pretty much turned the citrus industry upside down across the state. So there's changing economic conditions that exist. There's consumer preferences. There's the move toward locally sourced food. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that kind of niche market kind of things that are going to pick up in Florida. I mentioned we grow food when a lot of the rest of the country grows corn and soybeans and things that end up as feed for animals. Not that we don't ultimately eat it, but it is a step removed from what we concentrate on here in Florida. Pests and disease, I mentioned. Those last two are interesting, and you've read a lot about them probably, and we'll hear more about them, is the growing global population. In 2050 is scheduled to go from 7 to 9 billion. As that population both ages and expands, it's going to be much more middle class. There's going to be a lot more tendency to live in urban areas. 70% of the population of the world will be in an urban area by 2050. Urbanites eat more processed food. They eat more meat. We're going to have to increase food and feed production by 70% to feed that population. And I got to tell you, North America, this is outside of Florida, but North America is uniquely positioned to provide that additional capacity. When you look at a soils map of the globe, the best soils for agricultural production, the highest productivity soils with the lowest net nutrient input, are concentrated in North America. China isn't going to be able to feed themselves. India is not going to be able to feed themselves. Africa is not going to be able to feed themselves. They don't have the soil to grow the crops they need. We do. So does South America to a lesser extent. So there's going to be, continued to be, I think, agricultural production. We need access to water to meet that need. It's going to be an interesting ride for the next 20 or 30 years. That's all I had to say. Thank you.